An attractive young man with all the attention looking over the protagonist asked if she was ready to begin, then began stretching his shirt and smiled slyly. The protagonist madly glanced around at the men in front of her with embarrassment and stated that this had become a habit for her. Then the young man approached her and his hair turned silver white. The girl looked at him attentively and then with some awkwardness said that she was ready for it, and mentally stated that every night the same thing happened between them. Then she reached out her hand to his naked body, awkwardly and uncertainly, but something stopped her and she realized she couldn't get used to it, no matter how many times it had happened. At the sight of such a flustered protagonist, the guy wondered if the girl still continued to be shy. Then he gently took her hand in his and told her that Tyrant should stop worrying so much. And there she mentally tried to convince herself that she should think positively. And looking at the man who held her hand against his chest, she wondered if she would really have to go through this every night, because it seemed to her like absolute madness that would drive her crazy. Once upon a time, the young protagonist bent over her mother in tears, who informed Tyrant that she should by no means die, and then with an insanely heavy and tired look told her little daughter that if the girl survived, the whole world would be at her feet, and promised that she would do everything possible for her daughter to live the best possible life, and smiled happily one last time and told the girl that she loved her madly and she must survive. The protagonist did, and now as an adult, she remembered her mother's last words to her before she died. At that moment, the protagonist stood in front of the table where her father was sitting, who informed Tyrant that she should become the heir to the imperial throne of the Leonhardt Empire. But she decided to look at the man in front of her and thought that she absolutely did not want to do that. Then she looked carefully at the king of Lupian and thought that if she had known what her father's attitude to her would be after so many years, she would have run away a long time ago. But he gave her an attentive look and told her that apparently the girl was completely unaware of what was happening on the continent. Then the protagonist dryly stated that in order to get to the continent, she would need 2 months or even more, because there is an epidemic and a tsunami. Then the man asked what the girl thinks about the birth of an heir, but she calmly looked at King Lupian and said that she was not interested and asked why she should go as a pretender to the throne if she had an older sister. But he only rubbed his head tiredly and told Tyrant that she shouldn't pretend not to understand what had happened. Then pointed to her relatives, including an older sister with a broken arm, a younger sister with a scar on her face, and an older brother with a fractured left leg. King Lupian said angrily that Tyrant should look at all her brothers and sisters because she had managed to maim each of them. But she calmly looked around at the company and said that she had no intention of harming them and only wanted to protect herself. The king literally shouted at the girl that she had broken her sister's arm. Then the protagonist explained that her sister tried to push her down the stairs, and she was so scared, so she grabbed her arm. So they fell together. After King Lupian said that she had also broken her brother's leg and angrily wondered whether the protagonist even here could not see her own fault. But she calmly reported that the guy tried to kick her, so she too was forced to resort to self-defense. And so, because of her fright, she closed herself behind a chair, which her brother ended up kicking. Then the little sister ran up and hid behind the king's chair and began to cry, and after looking at all this, Lupian looked angrily at Tyrant and asked what had happened to the little sister, for she was about to make her debut in society. And now she has this disgrace on her face. But the protagonist calmly informed them that they should have found out who gave her the horsewhip instead of blaming her. Then she told me that her little sister had hit herself while she was swinging at Tyrant. She said coldly that she was fine, but she didn't understand how anyone could give a child such a dangerous thing. At that moment, the main character's younger sister burst into tears, and her older sister ran up to her and told her that the girl shouldn't worry because they would find the best healer, and he would definitely remove her terrible scar from her face. King Lupian shouted, telling Tyrant that she should stop picking fights and scandals in the family. Then he asked her how it was that her sisters and brother had become almost invalids, and she didn't have a scratch on her. Then the protagonist thought about what she was sure was the question that really kept her father in suspense, and all because she has a secret power that no one knows about. Neither the king nor the family members. Then the girl confidently looked at Lupian in front of her and said that there was definitely an explanation. If she had lied, she would not be alive for a long time because her whole family wants to kill her. At which point the king threw the inkwell at the girl with anger and shouted her name angrily, after which he resolutely informed her that she could no longer resist and she would go anyway as a pretender to the throne of the Leonhardt Empire. Looking at the ink stains on the luxurious carpet, the protagonist thought that it reminded her madly of the marks on the royal cheetah that Tariella had left by her very existence. But no one would dare to tell her about it. But the next moment the girl had absolutely no reaction to being soiled calmly informed her father that if he made her leave, Karajan would be insanely displeased. Karajan is the only legitimate successor, son of the queen, as well as heir to the throne, and he was the protagonist's older brother, as well as the only person who really cared for her. Then she looked at King Lupian carefully and wondered if he'd forgotten how much Karajan loved her. And then she sadly realized that her brother was sadly not here right now, as he had left to investigate a new epidemic. But he would have stood up for her. And apparently the king knew that, so he obviously planned ahead and sent the boy away. Then the protagonist looked at him seriously and said that as far as the emperor of the Leonhardt Empire was concerned, the man was well aware that he had executed half of his ministers as soon as he got the title. She had also heard that every night the man locked himself in his bedroom and drank so much that he confused day with night. And when the ministers asked him to decide on a candidate for empress, he gathered all the noble daughters of the empire. And rumor has it that he didn't like anyone, so he sent them all back. Then the protagonist remembered that when the struggle for the throne began, she was madly surprised that the current emperor had killed all his brothers, and thus took the throne. After which she scrutinized King Lupian and reported that Emperor Leonhardt is a tyrant, a womanizer, and a drunkard, so he is rightfully called the worst emperor of the continent. But the man looked at the girl in front of him and angrily informed her that she had to go because the only good thing about Tariella was that her face was so much like her mother's, and it was cute enough, so it had to be used before it was ruined. The next moment, Tariella looked at the king in all seriousness and wondered if he really planned to send her to her death. At which point her older sister and brothers spoke to her, and the girl informed her that if that one had died earlier, they wouldn't have had to do this. Then with a sly grin, she said that she didn't understand how the girl was still alive, because earlier she was almost dead, but her mother had somehow managed to save her. Then the main character remembered what she was talking about. She was 6 years old when she got very sick. Then her mother, sitting over the sick child, said that it would be okay if she didn't remember anything of what was going on because she had a high fever. And it was a miracle that the child was able to survive. And she really didn't remember any of it, and knew about what had happened only because of rumors. So she learned that in order to save her life, her mother had crossed the sea in other countries, as well as explored the bowels of the mountains. It was because of such efforts to save her life that the protagonist struggled to survive in such an environment. She looked back at King Lupian with determination when he informed her that Tariella should not even try to change the decision that had already been made. But the girl absolutely did not think about that and only pondered the fact that she must keep the promise she had made to her mother. The next moment, the king announced that Tariella should head to the Leonhardt Empire with thoughts of her doing her duty. But suddenly she was grabbed under the arms of 2 guardsmen and was surprised by this, not realizing what was happening. But the next moment, King Lupian smiled slyly and informed Tariella that he had completely forgotten to warn her that she was leaving for the empire right away. She looked at him indignantly and called him disgusting, then yelled that men should let her go. Time has passed, and the protagonist is not satisfied sitting in her carriage thinking about what she should have realized that when the king emphasized that the journey would take at least 2 months. Then 2 months is a fine result if there is a carriage and a good horse. They didn't have, and Tariella ended up having to travel for 3 months. She thought about the fact that she had heard earlier that many princesses had come to the Leonhardt Empire to compete for the title of empress, but they had all been rejected. So her original plan was that she would arrive, drop off her luggage, and rest after the journey, and only then would she see the emperor. If that's how it's supposed to happen, there's no reason to worry. So because of the fact that they couldn't meet at this moment, Miss was calmly walking to her room, happily thinking about the fact that he wouldn't like her quickly and would immediately run away from here and the Leonhardt Empire and the Kingdom of Lupian. Then she thought that the reason she hadn't run away earlier was that Tariella could tolerate anything no matter how much her relatives were bothering her, and she had a plan for revenge ready anyway. However, she is not satisfied with the fact that even though they have a relationship, selling her to a stranger is a new kind of bullying. And if the emperor rejects her, she is sure that when she returns to Lupian's home, she will find a new stranger, in which case she will definitely not be able to escape. So she thinks that she is insanely annoyed by all this and is ready to live her life on the run. But afterwards, she calmed down and happily thought about the fact that the empire was huge enough that she was unlikely to be found, and motivated herself to become rejected by His Majesty the Emperor as soon as possible and then travel. But suddenly she turned around and saw a tall, dark-haired man walking in front of her, surrounded by his servants. And then she excitedly wondered if this man might be the continent's worst emperor. His name was Levenful von Leonhardt. Surprised at the man who had already managed to approach her, the protagonist thought about the fact that she was not going to like this particular young man. The man looked at her excitedly and asked if she was the princess of the kingdom of Lupion. She bowed nobly before him and curtsied to greet His Majesty the Emperor of the Leonhardt Empire, then introduced herself as the princess of the kingdom of Lupion, Tyrant of Lupion, and she thought in shock that she had absolutely never expected to meet this man here, and didn't understand how he could know she had arrived, and perhaps now he would decide to send her home immediately after her arrival. But the emperor did not do so, and looking carefully at the girl, who was still bowed, asked her to rise and become Rovno. She did so, and then she looked at the emperor's face with all her attention, not knowing what to expect from this young man. But suddenly, at some point, his scrutiny of the girl turned into something more, and his eyes opened wide with surprise. All the while, the protagonist watched his emotions carefully and did not understand this reaction on the part of the young man, and she was confused by the extent to which he was staring at her uncovered. But suddenly, enlightening, fast Emperor Levenful von Leonhardt approached her, causing the girl to be very surprised. And the man with his eyes still wide open announced that he had finally been able to find her. She looked at him in surprise, not understanding what strange situation had happened to her, and still not realizing what the message of Levenful von Leonhardt's words was. He smiled happily and told Tyrella that he wanted her to marry him, but she literally glowed and embarrassed and told His Majesty the Emperor that she had misheard and asked him to repeat it. But no sooner had she done so than the man smiled happily at her and informed her that he wanted the girl to marry him madly. She realized that she should do so in order to disappoint the emperor with her health. Then she sadly said that she should probably see a doctor. She asked him if she had heard correctly that the emperor wanted to send her home right away, but he smilingly approached the protagonist and asked if this was the third time she wanted to hear him propose. But at this moment, One could not stand it and literally screamed with incomprehension, then asked whether Levenful von Leonhardt really wants to take her as a wife. And he smiled happily, watching such an amused reaction from the girl, said that they were able to cure her ears, and it seems now she is fine. She was literally shocked and did not understand why the emperor wanted to take her as his wife, and perhaps it was just a dream. And in fact, she is still in the carriage and only going to the Empire Leonhardt, and because of the exhausting road, she is dreaming such nonsense. She thought that he must be crazy to want to marry someone like her. At that moment, Levenful von Leonhardt turned to his advisor Jerem and said that the lady had agreed to his proposal, so they needed to agree on the day of the wedding ceremony. Having looked over the emperor absolutely carefully, he asked His Majesty if he wished to choose the next free day. But he looked at him unhappily, which caused surprise on Jerem's face, and then explained that the guy should go to the priest, and the priest will already help to choose a suitable date, because on this day, the empire will see in the princess and empress, so you can't choose any day in the calendar. After that, Jerem said that he also should not choose a date that was not too far away. The main character watched all this with great surprise and thought that apparently the emperor obviously needs a doctor, as he is not healthy in the head. But she paid absolutely no attention to her, and Jerem wondered if the emperor wanted him to find a balance between the two extremes. But the emperor crossed his arms in front of him and told his advisor that he should choose a day that was close enough and good enough. Jerem looked at the emperor with all his attention and listened to his demands and said that he understood and would try to choose an early day. The protagonist excitedly looked at the emperor and realized that she was now facing an alcoholic, violent, and lustful man who was literally the worst on the entire continent. And she could not marry such a man, for she had come here to escape her hated home, not to become empress. So she excitedly turned to the man and tried to explain that not considering their marriage was a good idea. He scrutinized her and told her that she had arrived as a candidate for the empress seat, and Teriel excitedly confirmed his guess. But afterwards, she was shocked to realize why the emperor had said such words. After all, she had really only been sent to the empire to marry this young man, so there was no reason for her to refuse. Interrupting her shock, Levenful von Leonhardt turned to Jerem and asked where the princess planned to stay. He calmly informed her that her place was in a separate building on the south side of the royal family. He thought deeply about the fact that he could not allow the future empress to live in some annex to the palace. Then, catching the train of thought of Livenful von Leonhardt, Jerem asked, "Does the emperor want to bring things to the main palace?" The heroine was shocked to see the majestic, huge building and did not understand if Livenful von Leonhardt really wanted her to live in such a huge, majestic building where the emperor and his entire family lived. But he calmly explained that until a separate bedroom was prepared for the future empress, the Jerem should put her in the room for special guests. Tyriella was horrified that she was going to be put in the VIP room in the main palace where the entire royal family was gathered, which did not please her. But suddenly the attention of Livenful von Leonhardt was attracted by the suitcase that stood at the feet of the protagonist, and stated that it seemed to him that the princess was in a hurry to get here and therefore brought with her only one suitcase. Then he asked her with a smile if she was so excited about the hope of meeting that she had completely forgotten about other things. Whereupon, to the great embarrassment of the protagonist, the man asked her did she really want to meet him that badly. But afterwards, she thought angrily that if she'd known it was going to be like this, she'd have brought a lot more stuff with her, buying her some time before they met. The emperor scrutinized her carriage and wondered if it was the carriage that the protagonist had arrived in. She awkwardly confirmed his guess. So he looked worriedly at Jerem and asked about the economic situation in the kingdom of Lupien. But he said that everything was fine in the kingdom and he had not heard that people there were in need. But the best thing to do is to ask the lady herself. The next moment, Livenful von Leonhardt asked a question that embarrassed the protagonist immensely. And she was really embarrassed not knowing how to answer it, because he reported that most of Tyriella's luggage looked a little shabby and unusable. Then asked did the princess decide to bring the things she was going to throw away. At that moment, she remembered her father, King Lupien, and thought that he was just a greedy idiot who had sent her to the emperor to marry him, and they gave her almost garbage with him. And apparently none of them even thought that the emperor would be furious when he saw the ragged princess, and she didn't understand how they could have miscalculated and ruined everything at the very end. Then she immediately noticed that the emperor's gaze became completely displeased as he looked around her carriage, which made her feel very uncomfortable and scared. And then she realized that if she said she wasn't going to marry him, it would be tantamount to asking him to kill her on the spot. So she thought of nothing better than to raise her hand excitedly and ask if she could rest after such a long trip and go to her room to clean herself up a bit. And she thought about the fact that her escape was likely to be postponed indefinitely. A little later, she was lying in a beautiful bathtub surrounded by caring maids, enjoying her time and thinking that she felt insanely good in this place, as there was great food all around, and she was also massaged with aromatic oils by caring maids. But at some point, while enjoying all the benefits that her status as future empress implied, Tyriella realized that she was getting used to it too quickly and should not relax. But after allowing myself a moment's weakness, I wondered if this is what life as empress really looks like. Then at night, looking over the courtyard outside her door, she thought it would be a pity to leave it all behind. But she could not marry such a tyrant, for her mother had told her to choose a good and worthy man to marry. But suddenly, Livenful von Leonhardt crept up behind her and inquired what gloomy thoughts had so darkened the mood of the protagonist. After which he smiled strangely and asked, did the girl want to run away? But calmly informed him that such an act would lead to nothing. Good protagonist closely followed his every move and then realized that apparently he thinks that he can scare her with the fate of the kingdom of Lupien. And apparently he thinks that this kingdom at least somehow cares about her. But to her great surprise, a guy informed her that Tyriella had absolutely not taken a proper carriage or any luggage with her, nor had she even taken any dresses except the one she had come in, which all proved that she would not be missed much in her homeland. Then he calmly informed her that he was not worried about the future of the kingdom of Lupien, but about the future of the princess. Her hair was developing in the evening wind, and she was mesmerized and staring at the man, awkwardly unsure how she should interpret such responses. Then she noticed that Livenful von Leonhardt now looked insanely mysterious. The moon, hidden behind a cloud, was shadowing his masculine face, so she couldn't understand what he was thinking or what he looked like at that moment. But afterward, the protagonist said that it would be insanely embarrassing if everyone around him found out that Princess Tyriella Lupien had secret powers, and he wondered how that might actually end up. At that moment, gazing carefully into his eyes, the protagonist immediately realized that the atmosphere in their room had changed dramatically. The Emperor of the Glorious Predator reported that apparently For the first time in several hundred years, a saint had been born. Tariella could clearly feel the inexplicable danger that came from the emperor because of that piercing gaze. After that, the man said that the birth of the saint was expected not only by the entire Holy Empire, but also by the entire continent. After that, he asked what would happen to the princess if everyone else knew about it. She literally blushed with shame, not understanding how the man could find out about it, because despite all the abuse in the kingdom of Lupian, she did not leave a scratch, and even with serious wounds, she did not die, because she has a sacred secret power and she really was a saint. But in the next moment, the protagonist thought of nothing better than to indignantly deny his words. But he smiled amusedly and said that the girl had thought too long about her answers. She only smiled awkwardly and said that he had imagined it, and that she was just very surprised by such accusations. Then she mentally began to think about how the young man could have found out about it, and thought that he might have spied on her back in the kingdom. But she realized that there was absolutely no such thing. Then she began to analyze the fact that she had never used her sacred power before, so no one could have guessed that she had it. But even if she didn't do anything about it, the wounds would still heal themselves. But after interrupting her from her agonizing musings, Livenful von Leonhardt inquired if the protagonist knew what was now happening on the continent. The girl excitedly gazed somewhere to the side and stated that she had not heard about it once, because now the continents and the whole world was literally collapsing before their eyes. For it's been 20 years since the world tree, the source of all life, withered and died, and the winds of death began to blow on the continent. And so plague and natural disasters struck the whole land. Constant drought, or on the contrary flooding, which did not allow the cultivation of grain and vegetables. So people died of both disaster and famine. And drought led to a huge number of massive fires that caused wild animals to leave the forests and attack people. And the sea was constantly raging with storms and tsunamis. So merchant ships and fishing boats went to the bottom, and no one could escape. After the emperor asked if she knew why the people were so eager for the birth of a saint. But she said she had no idea about it. But then she said she had mentioned earlier that she was not a saint. But Livenful von Leonhardt only said that he thought sainthood was a gift and a manifestation of divine love, but then scared the protagonist out of her wits. The emperor said that there are people who believe that life will return to the continent after the saint turns to the deity again, and said that her fear comes from a blind and twisted faith. Tariella looked around at Livenful von Leonhardt in frustration and couldn't understand how it was that the ruler of a neighboring state could find out that she was a saint. And then she scrutinized his penetrating gaze and noted that at the sight of his eyes, she had the feeling that this man saw through her, and she did not understand how to get out of this situation. And then tearfully remembered the promise she made to her mother that she would never tell her mother about her power. But then she realized that she had indeed kept that promise, and this young man had figured it out for himself. Then, in observing Tariella, a question reported that if the protagonist is going to escape, then all the other people will know that she is a saint, and then she won't be able to escape the increased attention. He calmly told her that it would be a good thing if the saint were to appear now, when she was needed, although people might be mistaken about her being able to save everyone. But he calmly looked into her face and said that the girl should not deny it, because he already knew everything, so her lies were meaningless. But she asked him why he thought she was lying to him. But to her great shock, he suggested that they go to the temple together to make sure. A spiritual priest can confirm if she is who he thinks she is, because the empire, unlike the kingdom, has high priests. The protagonist looked at the man unhappily, not understanding how she could get out of this situation, while the emperor calmly informed her that the priest would have enough power to understand the girl's true nature. She would not be able to lie to him. She immediately began to think that she shouldn't have hidden in the room before, and that the best option would have been to try to escape right away, after she got here. But still gathering all her resolve in her fist, she excitedly wondered if the emperor had decided to blackmail her. But he only laughed, wondering why the girl uses such horrible words, because he's only telling what might happen in the future. And it seems that the protagonist misunderstood him. She literally shook with fear, not knowing what to do, and began to think that perhaps the best option would be to run away right now. Then Livenful von Leonhardt, gazing intently at the beautiful full moon outside the window, said that he had not even thought of sending her to the temple. If he had really wanted to do so, he would have done it immediately without further ado. And then, to the girl's great shock, he told her that he actually wanted the exact opposite. Then, with a smile on his face and his hair shaved back, He said that he believed that no one should know the truth about Tyriella's true power. Then she immediately remembered the former emperor and realized that when they met in the afternoon, this man definitely had black hair, but now they were literally snow white. Scrutinizing the approaching man, Tell thought that perhaps she thought he was dark-haired, or perhaps there was a completely different person with her. But suddenly, to her great surprise, Livenful informed her that he was frantic to protect the protagonist. After that, he began to slowly stretch the buttons on his shirt and said that he wanted to protect her as well as her secret. The same only thought about the reason why the emperor so suddenly began to undress and suggested that perhaps this man wanted her to use her power now. At that moment, a young man confidently looked at the protagonist and said that he wanted her to stay with him, and then maddeningly tenderly embraced the fingers of her slender and graceful hands and moved them to his chest. The protagonist at first in horror did not understand whether she could really touch the emperor's body, after which she stated that she was absolutely not ready for such intimacy. But after she got herself together, she saw the tattoo on her chest, and then she realized it was a tree branch, and it was a magical barrier, a seal just above her heart, and she'd heard of it before. Then she remembered that it happened the day after the world tree died, when the continent was in the middle of a nightmare, and people were just desperate. But then an alchemist suddenly appeared and said he could bring their continent back to life. The alchemist, named Ginevra, who could be compared to no one else in power and knowledge, challenged the gods themselves. He extracted sap from the branches of a dead tree and began the experiment of injecting the sap into people's blood. And under the guise of a mission to save the world, the alchemist conducted his countless experiments. However, the moment the sap of the tree entered the human body, the person would immediately die, just like the branches of the tree itself. So to prevent this from happening, a pattern was carved over the heart, creating a protective barrier. But it was as if the gods were mocking mankind, for all the subjects died dried up and frozen in bizarre poses, resembling either statues or tree branches. And attempts to resist the gods turned out to be a cruel joke, and people began to search everywhere for the alchemist and his friends. But it did nothing, for they had literally disappeared. Then the protagonist, still holding Livenful von Leonhardt's hand, wondering why he has a seal. On that calmly smiling protagonist explained that everything is simple enough after all. He was the first and last person who survived these experiments of the alchemist. But Tyrriella looked at him worriedly and asked, "Doesn't he know that anyone who participates in the experiment will be executed if it becomes known?" But he gently stroked the soft skin of her hand and told her that he certainly knew about it. And one of the peace agreements on the continent had been concluded by a meeting to end the death penalty and enmity. And Livenful von Leonhardt, back when he was a mere prince, had become a party to it. But then he leaned over the girl and scrutinized her and told her that he had told her about it for a reason. He actually wanted to ask her to try to use her powers on him. Then, smiling and whispering in the ear of the protagonist, said that now that they know each other's secrets, they have nothing to fear. The girl understood what he wanted from her, but she was uncomfortable not realizing how she could use her powers, because she had never done anything like this before, and she was not sure of success. But then she thought that apparently the emperor was willing to take a risk because he really wanted it so badly. Then she put her hands to his chest and thought about the fact that she should try to concentrate and just channel the energy. At that moment, she and her every movement were being watched closely by Livenful von Leonhardt, who wondered if the protagonist wanted to push him away and run away. Then he gently grabbed her by the waist, pulling her closer to him, while Sheenbear, still resting her hands on his chest, tried to ask him to stop as she couldn't concentrate. At that moment, to the great surprise of both of them, the tattoo glowed brightly with a golden glow, and even Tyrriella herself was madly surprised by such a thing and did not understand what was happening. At this moment, with blackened hair, Livenful said that earlier he had promised that he would not tell the princess' secret to anyone, and then scrutinizing her face, he asked that from now on the girl heal him every night with her powers. She was madly surprised and could not find any words to comment on such a thing. But it wasn't necessary because the emperor, like a predatory beast of prey, looked at Tyrriella and asked her to stay by his side at all times, and then asked her to use her magic only on him. By this point, rumors had spread throughout the imperial palace that the emperor had decided to marry someone, and then another maid reported that Livenful von Leonhardt was marrying a newly arrived princess from the kingdom of Lupion. But her interlocutor excitedly inquired whether it was not just a rumor, Then the other confirmed her speculation, then said that he had heard earlier that the aristocrats had already started sending wedding invitations. And they say that the emperor takes great care of the bride and doesn't let anyone but the maids on duty into her chambers. That's why most of the servants in the palace saw the princess only from afar. But the girl looked as if the goddess herself had become human, and she was insanely beautiful. Then, preparing for the girl an insanely beautiful and appetizing dish, the maid reported that the princess was very thin, so that it was frightening not to be blown away by the wind. So apparently, the emperor sends her a lot of delicious food to make you feel better. As they left, the girls thought about who had access to the princess's bedroom and wondered who had access to it. But one of them thought that apparently the princess keeps some secret, or she attracts people, and in any case, no one and the servants did not expect that the place of the empress will ever be occupied. After all, Emperor Leonhardt was quite a specific person. Apparently, the princess was able to make people to herself, and she wants to follow, so is a wonderful quality for the ruler. The protagonist was lying on her bed in horror, thinking about the fact that the emperor has a really good advisor, Jerem, because he organized their wedding insanely fast. But the emperor was also keeping up with his advisor, and so he thought that since the girl had agreed to become empress, it would be possible to turn her into a room in the storehouse with gifts, and also to visit the room where the past empress had lived. And yet her room was in the Damascus Palace, which is insanely close to the peace tree, a place where even in chaos, the blessing of the tree is preserved. After that, the protagonist was embarrassed to think that no emperor had ever granted a whole palace to anyone before, which made her feel insanely ashamed. Moreover, she felt even worse because the palace was really insanely good. And to make matters worse, her room was insanely close to the emperor's. She didn't understand how she could stay calm in a room so close to Livenful von Leonhardt's. But then Teriella calmed down and thought that no matter how much she resented it, she now had everything she had ever lacked. Dresses, jewelry, the bedroom of a former empress, and an entire castle, and apparently she was now living a truly luxurious life she had never known before. But Teriel thought sadly that living in such luxury, she was very afraid of returning to a past life of fear and hunger. But rising from her seat, the protagonist realized that she and Livenful von Leonhardt were in the same situation, so she must believe him. But then she sadly thought about the fact that her future husband was the only person of his kind who had survived the experiment, and this thought literally did not fit in her head. After all, she had heard that no one had ever survived after such an experiment, and so she asked her future husband about it. He calmly explained that it was all just legends and fairy tales, as he was direct proof fact. Then Teriellis wondered what happened after he became emperor, or was he involved in this experiment while he was still a prince? Her attentive gaze didn't go unnoticed by the guy who smilingly informed her that his body was perfectly fine, so she had nothing to worry about. And then, to the surprise of the protagonist, he smiled affectionately and said that thanks to the girl, he feels good. But when the next night, the magic of the seal will start working again and the color of his hair will change. She was madly surprised and wondered if no one had ever noticed the changes that were so obvious before. But then, to her great surprise, the emperor asked if the protagonist had heard that at night he locked himself in his room and drank all night. The young man was probably the one who had spread such rumors, but he said that it was a really good alibi that excluded unwanted meetings. Whereupon he sensibly remarked that when he was still a prince, there was much less interest in him. So it was usually easy for him to hide without such rumors, but now it was completely different. After which he gave the protagonist an attentive look and informed her that this was the reason he needed Teriella Lupian. Hearing such a thing, the protagonist is excited to think about the fact that before, everyone who had anything to do with the experiment had been killed. Gender, age, and social status were irrelevant, and she realized that if the secret of Livenful von Leonhardt was revealed, the continent would be plunged into war. It would be another challenge to the gods, and war would break out both inside and outside the empire, and the emperor would be defeated. She wondered why he didn't turn to a high priest or a healer who had similar abilities to hers. But if she was able to cure him, someone else must be able to. If she was capable of curing him, someone else should be able to. But Livenful only lowered his head sadly and said that he had previously warned that this was their shared secret with the princess, so no one should know about it. But the girl looked at him uncertainly and asked him what would happen if she accidentally spoke up. but he calmly replied that in that case, he would probably just kill her. Then she looked at him carefully and asked him why he trusted her so easily and how he knew she had holy power. He tried to evade the answer and said that he had only guessed, but the protagonist knew that it was not so, so she gave him the most confident look and said that the emperor was sure of what he was saying. Then she remembered that only her mother knew about her powers, so she asked how he knew everything, after which, to the prince's great shock, she asked him if he knew her mother, but he awkwardly assured her that he didn't know her mother. Then he told her that before that he had information that the Holy One could heal him, and apparently his body reacted and felt the holy energy in her. But he said it in a crazy, unsure way that didn't go unnoticed by Tyriella. But the girl didn't question him further and assured him that everything was fine and there was no problem. Her question was only out of curiosity. The girl looked at the man's face and thought that if she agreed to do so, she would become an accomplice, and if they were discovered, she would be executed too. And then if they were exposed, she would be executed as well. So the consequences of revealing their secrets are very different. So she looked at his smug face with great displeasure and wondered how he could talk so calmly about something like that. But he said that if the protagonist did not agree, she could go to the temple to tell the truth and return to the gods. But she obviously didn't want that, so she worriedly and awkwardly wondered if they had any chance at all of solving the problem. Then wondered if she should run away or if it was too late. The emperor smiled slyly and asked if she was thinking of running away again. Then he said that it would be very hard for Tyriella to hide when everyone knew who she really was, because all the citizens of the continent would rush to find the saint. Then he said that if the protagonist had made a deal with him, she'd be on the plus side too. Then he easily said that as long as there was no big disaster, they could do whatever they wanted. Then he scrutinized her and told her that if she became empress, she would have more power than one could imagine. After that, he enthusiastically began to tell the protagonist that she with her power will be able to bring anyone to their knees and make them do what she wants, because her status will allow her to do such a thing. But the protagonist did not even finish listening and grabbed his hand and shook it and said that she agreed to such an arrangement. Then with a smile, she began to think that it didn't matter to her whether it was easy or hard, because any problem could be solved and the emperor would be killed sooner or later because the world was cruel enough. After noticing her burning eyes, Livenful reported that the princess' gaze was just brimming with determination, which he liked immensely. So the protagonist remembered all the details of their conversation and realized that she was now exactly the same situation. And now the emperor needed her, so she wouldn't die. And she wouldn't die of any disease, not even the strongest one that could shake the emperor's health. But she was still worried about how Livenful von Leonhardt could know about her powers. But then she thought that if anything seemed suspicious, she would run away to another country and tell the truth about the emperor. Then with a thumbs up, she began to reflect on the fact that the emperors had promised to let her go if she lasted 1 year, and so she was bound to make it, for a free life, and to make her family answer for everything they had done to her. Eventually, in the kingdom of Lupien, Troll and his daughters and son had a dinner, and on the agenda was Tyriella becoming Empress / At that moment, her brother laughed and said that such a worthless girl could never become Empress, and if she succeeded, he should have his other leg broken too. The older sister smiled and said that Tyriella, if she came back, would probably be in a coffin. The younger sister thought deeply and reported that if one looked only at looks, Tyriella was indeed insanely beautiful. And remembering her older sister said Tyriella was the most beautiful girl she'd ever seen. The older sister said that Tyriella was an ordinary girl, but as soon as she spoke, her mouth started to fill with nonsense. Then she added that the children of noble families and royalty in other countries should be grateful to them for saving them from marrying that girl, who had the worst temper in the world. Well, then the dialogue was entered by King Lupiona, who smilingly informed that his eldest daughter was absolutely right, and Tyriella's character was absolutely similar to that of the emperor, because he too was mentally unstable. So the girl would not even return home in the form of a corpse. Then he coldly informed her that the emperor was cruel, so the emperor's castle would become Tyriella's tomb. And if she returns, it won't be a big deal, because he heard earlier that King Shalom is looking for a queen. So if she returns, they will send her to him. The younger sister excitedly announced that the king was over 70 years old, and the older brother excitedly remarked that more than 30 queens had already died at the hands of this man, and then said that even so, Karajan, the brother of the green-eyed fool, should be coming home soon. So he asked his father what they would do if Karajan started looking for the protagonist. After hearing the question, the table was silent for a while. Everyone knew that Karajan was one of the strongest mages and hardly anyone on the continent was able to defeat him. And everyone knew that he was madly in love with his little sister. Remembering Karajan, the younger sister excitedly suggested that they lie and say that Tyriella wanted to leave. Her brother agreed with this idea and said that if she died in the palace of Emperor Leonhardt, they had nothing to fear as they would not be discovered. King Lupian thought about it, then wiped his mouth and finished his dinner, and said that Karajan is investigating the epidemic, so he won't be returning to the royal castle anytime soon. But they should be careful that he doesn't get the news of Tyriella's departure. Then he looked earnestly at his children and said that Karajan should be the last to know about it, and only after he's done with his business and returned. And when he does, that girl's funeral will be in full swing, so he can say goodbye to her. At this time, the emperor had already come to the main character, who had habitually undressed and prepared for the healing. The girl was doing her business and looked at her husband excitedly and admitted to herself that she still couldn't get used to the fact that such a crazy man with no sense of compassion, but such a handsome and sexy man was her husband. But her gaze did not go unnoticed by the emperor, who approached her and asked if the princess was thinking about something obscene while she was being treated. She was very much surprised by such a question and, of course, began to deny it. The girl thought that her new husband was insanely observant, which made her angry. But her blush was not unnoticed by Levenful von Leonhardt, who pointed it out without hesitation. But then she turned to the emperor and said that he had misunderstood her a bit, and explained that she would have blushed even if she had touched not His Majesty Emperor Leonhardt, but the same Counselor Jerem. But hearing about it, his facial expression became much more raw. He said that if it really happened, someone would obviously see his own blood, and it would be very terrible. The girl did not fully understand his reaction, so she calmly said that she would be much more comfortable to treat him if he did not undress, because every time she morally insanely difficult to put her hands on his chest. But Levenful von Leonhardt calmly informed the princess that it is certainly not a problem, but treatment without clothes, he liked it much better. The girl scrutinized his face and saw some strange satisfaction. So she asked what was the reason for his love of nudity, then said that the emperor every time has to spend time to dress and undress. But the next moment, madly unexpected for Tyriella, Levenful von Leonhardt came insanely close and gently picked her up by the waist, so that her arms were touching his powerful, strong, muscular torso. And he smiled slyly and asked the girl if she could guess the reason why he preferred to do it that way. The princess, blushing with embarrassment, noticed that they were unforgivably close to each other and absolutely did not know how to behave because she was burning from the herd. Then the girl awkwardly lowered her face and told the slightly embarrassed emperor that if he continued in the same vein, she would go to bed before midnight and His Majesty would become a drunkard again and shut himself up in his bedroom. But he calmly took her hand and forced the girl to raise her worried look and look into his eyes. And then Levenful von Leonhardt told the protagonist that she did not need to worry about it, because if she does not like everything that is happening, they can stop at any time. The girl, excitedly looking at him, did not understand what this phrase meant, and then wondered what would happen if she said that she really likes everything and whether he would then do whatever he wants. Then the protagonist decided to change the topic of conversation. So she awkwardly distanced herself and said that they would soon have a wedding ceremony and she was worried sick about it. The emperor calmly said that he was happy about it because it was also his first marriage. So he was pleased to know that he was not the only one worried about it. Eventually, they sat down across from each other in the chairs, and the emperor looked at the girl with a maddeningly calm and worried look and asked if she wanted King Lupian to attend the wedding, and if she didn't want him to, then he could just not send him and her family an invitation. The protagonist was madly surprised and wondered why he was asking such a thing, but he calmly said that he had the impression that she didn't really want to see her family. The protagonist looked down in embarrassment and thought about the fact that she hadn't told him anything at all, but the man was perceptive enough to realize it himself. Then the protagonist, confused and worried, looked up at him and wondered why His Majesty would say such a thing. After all, Lupian is her family, and they are obliged to attend the wedding. The emperor looked at her worriedly, while the girl was explaining that she wanted her sisters and brothers to get an invitation. He was insanely restless, so determined to look at the protagonist that she could trust him. But the protagonist resolutely clenched her fist and said that if they arrived at the wedding ceremony, She could see her whole family die of envy, and ominously announced that such a sight would rarely be seen again. So she had to see it all in person to go to bed in a great mood, and she just couldn't wait for that day. But suddenly, to her surprise, the emperor wondered how the protagonist could really be so cruel. And she said it was all about her mother and decided to tell him the story. Then, remembering her mother, Tyrant said that her mother loved her so much that everyone else could only envy her, and it was her mother who taught her to love herself and never give up. Her mother was an insanely strong woman, and even though there was only one person in the world who loved Tyrant, she had nothing stronger than that love. Her mother was always there to support her and guide her to the true path, and also constantly stood up for her, saying that if she had done nothing wrong and was confident in herself, she shouldn't despair. After all, she has her whole life ahead of her and will be loved endlessly. Upon hearing this short story, Livenful von Leonhardt stated that the girl's mother was an insanely wise woman and a good person. She only replied that according to rumors, her mother had never hugged her after she was born. But when she was 3 years old, everything changed, and maybe she was ashamed that she didn't do anything for her. Upon hearing this, the emperor lowered his head thoughtfully and said that few people in principle could fully side with the child. So her mother was indeed an amazing person back then. The protagonist looked carefully at the pensive man in front of her and wondered if he had any good memories of his mother. And she didn't like the sad expression on his face. Then she realized that she knew absolutely nothing about the emperor. Not about him or his family. But the next moment she was taken out of her sad thoughts by a guy who said with a smile on his face that if the protagonist wanted to, he would send an invitation to the wedding to all of Luthien. The girl heard this and literally glowed and joyfully announced that she would be looking forward to this moment. Seeing such a joyful Tyrant, the man said that in this case, he would choose the fastest method of delivery. So a few weeks passed and Her Highness was informed that the Lupin family had arrived. Then all 4 people bowed before the emperor and welcomed the son of the empire. And the protagonist, quite observing this picture, thought that finally came such a long-awaited day for her. And now these people will answer to her for everything they have done. Looking over the arriving Lupins, Livenful von Leonhardt proudly announced that the people had taken an insanely long time to get here, and he considered it a great honor for them, because he had never waited so long in his life before. At that moment, the protagonist's father, along with her sisters and brother, bowed down to him, apologizing. The protagonist just watched contentedly, happy that she was finally able to see these people kneel down in front of her. But at that moment, the emperor literally glowed and said that he only wanted to cheer them up after such a long journey. But it seems he had overdone it a bit. At this moment, gazing into the attentive gaze of Livenful von Leonhardt, King Lupien reported that he was even a little frightened at first, and reported that the emperor had a terrific sense of humor. But afterward, to the shock of the main character's relatives, Livenful revealed that it was actually only half a joke. Then he looked at them carefully and told them that their journey was not so long, because the princess had to get to him for 3 months. Then he looked at them with a scornful look and said that apparently there were many good engineers in the kingdom of Lupien, and asked why the carriage made of rotten boards had been traveling for 3 months. Then he scrutinized the king with undisguised contempt, as if threatened, and said that their engineers should be trained by the engineers of the Leonhardt Empire. It would be a sin to miss such knowledge. Then he added that he wouldn't be surprised if the princess's carriage had a wheel fallen off on the way and collapsed on the spot, because it was in a terrible state. And yet the carriage was still running. At first, King Lupien tried to justify himself, but afterwards he listened in shock as the emperor said that he had been thinking for a long time that could it be that when as a potential bride they sent a lady in a rotten wagon, which at any moment could fall off a wheel. In fact, King Lupien wanted to show off the miracle of engineering in their kingdom. Seeing the tension on the king's face, Livenful von Leonhardt laughed again and smiling said that he seemed to have overdone it again with his jokes, and it was unlikely that the king would have done it on purpose. But the next moment the man's face changed dramatically, and with contempt and menace he said that unless it was done on purpose, it was disrespectful not only to the princess, but also to the person to whom they had sent her. So they were literally spitting in the emperor's face. After that, he gently put his arm around the main character's shoulders and took her small hand in his and started to look at it. Then he said that he considered himself a very hospitable person, and therefore, since Tyrella and her relatives had not seen each other for a long time, He was ready to invite them to talk about family matters. She literally glowed with happiness, realizing that now it will begin, and thanked His Majesty for such care. After which she happily greeted her sister's daddy and brother. She smiled happily, but her voice sounded threatening, and said that she hadn't seen them in a long time, and that she missed them so much. So after a while, the protagonist and her family reached the Imperial Palace, which recently became her home. And then her brother began to excitedly ask the girl, is she really decided to marry the emperor? And the protagonist, looking at him unhappily, thought that he had forgotten his father's warning that none of his children should speak to her until he returned from the emperor. In the end, the protagonist never answered and just tired and exhaled and asked her brother where Karajan was now, because she wanted to see him, not their faces. But suddenly the voice of her older sister said that Karajan was still dealing with the epidemic, so he couldn't come, and there were more problems than they thought. So the case dragged on. But the protagonist was confused, so she thought about the fact that she thought if her brother found out about her wedding, he would drop everything and come. So the situation wasn't looking good. She calmly explained that earlier the Loops had sent her as a bride, and now they were surprised that everything had worked out. Then the protagonist said with a smile that apparently they had thought that the emperor would kill her, so it was quite interesting to see their disappointed and surprised faces when they received the wedding invitation. But at that moment, her older sister screamed and asked the protagonist what she was saying, because she was now the future empress. But the protagonist calmly spread her hands and with a sly smile told her sister that now she could do whatever she wanted. And apparently they still didn't understand what was really going on, and asked if they wanted to say anything to her, but they remained silent and didn't dare to say anything. Then she thought that apparently they had decided that if they treated her normally, she would forget all the bullying and attempts to kill her that had gone on before. But then she noted that this behavior was very much in line with their images. Then she mentally warned them that her plans for her revenge would not change unless they shut up and calmed down. But then the older sister decisively announced that in fact it was all their plan. Even the older brother of the protagonist was madly surprised by such a statement from his sister. Trying to hide her uncertainty, the sister informed that if they hadn't sent the protagonist to the empire, she would never have been able to become an empress. After that, she came closer and poked her forehead with her hand and said that earlier the girl said that she didn't want to go to the empire, but if they hadn't forced her, she would still be eating leftovers. So the protagonist should be very grateful. And then with a smile said that a girl should appreciate such wonderful relatives who gave her a chance to change her life. The protagonist looked around silently and realized that apparently her relatives still hadn't realized that they were in her palace and not the other way around. But when she saw the faces, the protagonist realized that she was mistaken and that they understood whose house she was in. But in spite of this, it did not even occur to any of them that now she would have to communicate with her more carefully. Then she thought about how her elder sister could think that the maids of this palace in which Tyrant lived would side with the girl that only recently came here, and began to belittle their mistress. Then she stated that until then she was just garbage under their feet. But since then, everything has changed. She looked at her older sister firmly and said that if they were going to continue lying to her so brazenly, they should at least pretend to believe in their own words. But her older sister was clearly aggrieved and looked at her angrily and demanded that she repeat what she had said. But she calmly said that they probably didn't want to get their hands dirty because everyone was looking at them. After all, they are from the royal family and they don't need such attention. At that moment, her brother stood up for her older sister and said that Tyrant had apparently gotten a little overconfident as soon as she became empress and thought she could say such things. Then he reminded her that the wedding hadn't happened yet. But she calmly looked at them with a maddeningly contemptuous look and wondered if they could think of anything more clever. Her brother looked at her unhappily and asked her if she suspected what her father was doing now. He went to persuade His Majesty the Emperor to choose another candidate to marry, for the Emperor would surely want someone better than her for a wife. The protagonist smiled gloatingly as she realized that they had just told the whole truth and made a mistake on such a small thing, and ruined everything themselves. So apparently they really don't realize the position they are in. So she resolutely looked around at all three of them and said that apparently they had originally planned to kill her when they returned to the kingdom of Lupian. And her brother resolutely said that apparently the protagonist had finally realized and asked if she wasn't scared. But she only smiled gloatingly with the understanding that apparently, even despite her high title, none of them were going to apologize to her for the past treatment. But suddenly they were interrupted by a servant who bowed and said that a message had come from the emperor. And the brother immediately went to this man, snatching his scroll, and already threatened the protagonist that the emperor had definitely rejected her. So when she returned to the kingdom, she was finished. And the servant was clearly displeased with such behavior on the part of this young man. But the protagonist only smiled gloatingly and informed her brother to finally start reading. And as she expected, the next second, the young man's face contorted in horror and fear, and he literally could not believe his eyes. And the protagonist was watching this picture and already guessed what he saw there. So she slyly inquired why his expression had changed. And she herself thought that Livenful von Leonhardt had not married her because he needed more power or lacked women. He needed her strength, and she was sure that he would not find someone with the same. The next moment, his sisters approached his brother and, reading the emperor's messages, shook in shock. I don't understand why such a man decided to marry her. Then the protagonist sat down on the sofa and said that tomorrow morning she would inform her husband, the emperor, that her relatives intended to kill her. But those in a panic started stuttering and saying that the girl was lying, and they didn't say anything about the murder. And the sister just said that absolutely no one would believe her. But the protagonist calmly looked at them and wondered why they thought she couldn't do it, because all those people in the room could hear their conversation. She smiled sweetly and obviously satisfied, then said that her relatives had better keep their mouths shut if they didn't want to be left without one. Then she said that they should realize as soon as possible that this was her palace and people wouldn't cover up their lies and threats like the servants in their house did. Then smiled and said that the servants in this palace would not side with them, but with her. She was their mistress. Sometime later, the protagonist found herself at a tea party with her future husband, the emperor, and the emperor, scrutinizing his bride, said that apparently she had a lot of fun while she was socializing with her family, and the mood of the Lupéons had clearly improved since her arrival. She said she couldn't guarantee anything, but their meeting was really, really happy. Then she remembered how majestically and regally sitting on the sofa, she asked her sisters and brother what would happen to them if His Majesty the Emperor found out about the incident. Then she warned that the young people must know what a fame the Emperor is. But after looking at their worried faces, she said that since they were never family, she was willing to give each of them one chance. And after smiling radiantly, said that each of them should bow before her and sincerely apologize, after which she is really ready to forgive everyone. She looked around at the disgruntled people and said in a friendly manner that it was much better than losing their heads. So they had nothing to lose except their immense pride, but they said nothing. So Tyriel looked them over from head to toe in displeasure and wondered why they were delaying. After that, she ordered them all to kneel down, and they, like trained dogs, immediately did so and began to argue among themselves about who was the first to bow down to her sister. Her younger sister scolded her elders and said that she had bowed down so quickly that she had even hit her forehead on the floor. But suddenly the emperor was brought out of his musings and said that without joking, it looked as if the Lupians were very preoccupied with something and Tyriella must have done something. But then he warned the girl that she should not waste herself on each of them, and she could safely trust him in this matter. Then he said that even a small mosquito constantly buzzing above her ear could spoil her nerves. But the girl calmly turned her gaze to her cup of tea and said that it would be ugly if she told him about their family quarrels, especially since as soon as he touched on the subject, the problem would become political. So he should not interfere. Family problems should stay in the family. If it turns into a fight between the kingdom and the empire, it will bring a lot of problems. The future husband was quite surprised at such a sensible reflection of the protagonist, and then looking at her carefully said that despite such sensible reflections, she looks happy enough talking about it. And she awkwardly admitted to herself that she had completely forgotten that by saying such a thing she should look less pleased. At that moment, the man smiled favorably and looked at Tyriella with a kind of tenderness, saying that she'd convinced him, so he would respect her will and let her work it out for herself. The protagonist looked at him in shock and thought that she could not imagine that a man whom everyone knows as a tyrant could be such a nice gentleman with her. Then the protagonist, excitedly looking at him, said that from the beginning she wanted to ask about something. But Livenful von Leonhardt calmly asked why she decided to talk only now and said that in the future she should not be shy. Then the girl looked awkwardly at the emperor and asked if his counselor Jerem knew that he changed every night. But he calmly explained that he should not have such information, even though he trusted him, but it was definitely not something he should know about. Then she looked at him excitedly and seemed a little frightened. She asked him who knew about it, but he said firmly that she was the only one who knew about it. And she realized that the emperor must have been extremely sensitive to this Tanya, since he had only revealed himself to one person. But then she thought that it seemed to her that such a secret was easy enough to keep, because it was not so obvious. But most likely the young man was still very hard all this time. So the girl stated that Counselor Jerem is always close to the emperor, so it's amazing how he managed to keep everything secret from him for so long. Scrutinized the protagonist, the man said that unfortunately Jerem had no reason to appear in his bedroom late at night. But it was heard by the counselor, who shook with horror and asked what the emperor and his future consort were talking about. And then in shock, almost shouting, asked why he had to appear in His Majesty's bedroom late at night and why he had said that he regretted it. The emperor, laughing at him, called him a prankster and said that it was not good to eavesdrop. But then, madly embarrassed, he said that he had not intended to eavesdrop at all and had overheard it by chance. Then he turned to the princess and asked her not to take His Majesty's words in a wrong way, because there was no special relationship between them. Then Jerem exhaled calmly and was glad that Lady Teriel had easily understood, and fortunately did not have time to come up with horrible pictures in her fantasy. But then the protagonist, pursuing the purpose to laugh a little at the advisor, said that he should not worry because she respects the choices and preferences of other people, so will respect them. And he asked in shock whether the future empress can respect him and not his preferences. The girl literally glowed with joy, realizing that there was such an amusing and funny situation, and thought that most likely the emperor is also delighted. But after Lievenful von Leonhardt said that they should stop joking and asked the counselor who was collecting the papers what kind of documents he had brought. Gathering everything in a pile and holding it out to His Majesty, the counselor said that this list of aristocratic families that would like to welcome the princess before the wedding. And then the emperor, looking at the impressive pile, asked, "Is it really all letters from these families?" He confirmed his hunch, and the protagonist, that was watching in horror, said that it would take years to meet each of the representatives of these families. When the emperor heard about it, he immediately told his advisor that the princess didn't have that much time, so he should refuse everyone. But Jerem excitedly looked at the man and said that it wasn't the best choice. But the man unhappily said that it was an order and asked if his advisor wanted to argue with him. But the man calmly replied that he was not arguing at all. He was only advising. That was his job. After that, Jerem handed all these letters to the protagonist and grudgingly looked at the emperor, asked, does he really want to turn his wife into an outcast and make her the same as he was himself? He looked at His Majesty with a tired look and said that it was good enough to have a variety of people around him, especially dark horses. So he chose a few people whose connections could be useful. The protagonist, scrutinizing all these papers, asked if she should get acquainted and get close to all these people. But he calmly replied that there is no question of getting close. But all these aristocrats are really good people. She was surprised enough, so she asked him to explain what he meant. Then Jerem calmly said that among these aristocrats, there are those who are engaged in illegal activities, such as working with illegal substances, and such people are everywhere. And the upper class is not an exception. The emperor looked at him carefully and asked why Jerem thought that the princess should have contact with such people. But he calmly explained that she didn't have to have contact with them, but at least she should know about them, because in the future she would become an empress. Teriela realized that the advisor was really clever and was absolutely right, because she made a deal with Lievenful von Leonhardt and got the power to make her family apologize to her. So now she's responsible.